differentiation isn't as important as being distinct. Different is being different. Distinct is in fact standing out. So what you want to do is you want people to notice you, and then you want them to know what you do. When I was CMO there, he said to me, if you're going to be the CMO of our company, you need to have a much bigger profile on LinkedIn, and you need to help us do that as a company. You really need to figure out what you are passionate about, because at the end of the day, it's much easier to speak about topics that you find interesting. And as a result, people will sort of take that interest and use it for sort of reasons to follow you.
All right, I'm here with Bryan Law, the CMO at SentinelOne. He joined the company in 2024. SentinelOne is an AI-powered cybersecurity platform that's securing some of the world's largest enterprises. The company was founded in 2013, went public in 2021. They have about 3,000 employees, about $1 billion in ARR. Bryan is also on the board of Meltwater and on the executive advisory board of G2. And before joining SentinelOne, he was CMO at ZoomInfo and SVP marketing at Salesforce. So I would say a real enterprise software marketing veteran. Bryan, thank you for joining, and anything to correct or amend there in that intro?
No, really great of you to have me on, Finn. And actually really exciting. SentinelOne just crossed the $1 billion mark. We announced it publicly at the end of August.
Amazing, cool. The reason why I wanted to have you on the show, or the main thing that triggered me to reach out to you, was this LinkedIn post that you did a couple weeks ago about SentinelOne being the fastest growing company on LinkedIn in terms of followers for publicly traded companies.
Yep.
And you guys grew 61% in followers over the last 12 months, which is, I think, pretty impressive. And you made some really good statements in that post that you treat LinkedIn as a primary channel instead of as an afterthought, and what that means. So I definitely want to dive into that. I also saw a little bit of controversy around that post, or not controversy, but some people created a little field day for a bunch of people on LinkedIn when you posted that. But before we dive into that and all the good stuff, I saw something that you said, and I think it's great to just briefly touch on. Can you talk to me about the difference between distinctiveness and differentiation, and why that matters to marketers?
Yeah, and it's a really important sort of difference in terminology. And so, as I was sort of coming into the marketing field, and even in business school, I learned about differentiation as the key thing you want to do. So you want to show why your brand, your products are different than your competitors. And as I sort of got further in my career, I came across a group called the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. It's the largest marketing research institute out there. They wrote the book How Brands Grow. They've written 4 books in total. I'd recommend reading all of them. And they talk about, in sort of just practical sort of everyday life, differentiation isn't as important as being distinct. Different is being different. Distinct is in fact standing out. So what you want to do is you want people to notice you, and then you want them to know what you do. And that's actually the most important thing, because what research has actually found is all of our brands are essentially branded versions of the category. So when you think of SentinelOne, it's normally in the context of cybersecurity. Most people aren't going to know all of the components of SentinelOne versus one of our competitors. But what we do want them to do is, in a buying situation, when they're thinking that they have an issue, we want them to think about SentinelOne so that they reach out to us and talk to us, either from a marketing perspective or a sales perspective. So that's sort of the core way to think about those two terms. And it can get more into the research behind why distinctiveness is, in fact, a much better way to go.
Can you give me a specific example of what that might look like for a marketer on explaining how you're different versus how you're distinct? Like when we think about, I don't know, even a LinkedIn post on a very granular level, like what would the difference
between the two? Yeah, so one of the things to think about is the idea of, we all have certain brand assets. So that many times is your logo. It could be the word mark. It could be the colors that you use. You could use a character. Those are all things that are going to be associated with your brand. And what you want people to do is recognize those. And when they recognize them, they then will think of you. So I'll use Salesforce as an example, because it's a really big one in the B2B space. Sort of that cloud with Salesforce, sort of the characters, in particular Astro. are very well known and easily associated with Salesforce. And so you see them, you immediately think Salesforce. So that is standing out and being distinctive. That would be separate from being differentiated, which is when you think of Salesforce, you may think ease of use versus someone else, or maybe you think, Monday.com is actually a sort of more intuitive platform. Those would be the
Mm-hmm.
differences that you would associate with the brands. And again, distinctiveness has
Mm-hmm.
been found from a marketing perspective to be more important than being differentiated.
The example that comes to mind for me is Gong, and I'm not a buyer. I'm not in market for a revenue intelligence platform, but they're definitely distinct to me. And I'm going to have Udi Ledogor on the podcast later this
Great.
week, and I wouldn't be able to tell anyone how they're different to Clary or any of the other platforms, but they occupy a very distinct place in my head, and the boldness that they have in their communication and even the color templates. Is that roughly
It
how to think about it?
it is with sort of maybe an addition. So the way that our brains practically work is we have buying situations. In those buying situations, our brain essentially fires. We have lots of different nodes in our brain, and it could be thoughts, feelings, emotions. So whatever in that buying situation, your brain fires those nodes. You want to figure out what those nodes are and attach your brand to it. So the most important part outside of standing out is making sure it's attached to things that are relevant for the buying situation. And so for Gong, that could be, hey, I want to do call recording, or I want to make sure I understand what my customers think about. How can I do sort of customer research at scale? Or it could be, hey, I'm trying to figure out how many competitor mentions I'm dealing with. All of those might be buying situations that would trigger a
Mm-hmm.
problem set in your head that hopefully, in Gong's case, they would think about Gong as a potential solution to those problems. So it is providing the what is the product, who is it used for, when is it used for, sort of that type of information, in addition to actually standing out so that people know to think about you when they're ready to buy.
I know we're spending some time on here, but I do feel like it's super useful. When you joined SentinelOne, which is relatively fresh, you joined last year,
Mm-hmm.
did you go through any process to determine what are the distinctive features of SentinelOne that you want to highlight? Did you go through any process there? Anything you can share specifically?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll maybe you talk about it as an evolution. So when I first came across this approach, I used a more sort of traditional way of getting at this information. So you would go and you would do essentially panels of people. You'd figure out, we're selling to this audience. Let's reach out to them and say, hey, when you're thinking about this category or you're in this buying situation, what would be the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions that would come to mind? And then how do you think about us? How do you think about competitors? And so I actually did that when I was at Tableau. I did a version of that when I was at ZoomInfo. And because of AI, there's actually new ways to do that using synthetic audiences. And in particular, the company that I have found value in is Evidenza. And so I used them the first time when I was at ZoomInfo, and then I actually used them again here at SentinelOne. And we used it as a way to actually inform all of our sort of messaging that we now use at a top level. So we reached out in our case to people in the security space, people in the IT space, at the types of companies that we care about, and we tried to understand that information and what would actually resonate. And it is foundational to how we think about our messaging and our messaging framework today.
Interesting. I have seen some people use ChatGPT, and maybe this is a naive version of doing this, to essentially create synthetic like user forums where they basically say,
Yeah.
hey, you are a CISO at a large B2B tech firm, and here's your criteria. You're 55 years old and yada yada yada, and then you can have a conversation with this artificially created persona. Is this roughly
Yeah.
how to think about it?
Yeah, directionally. And the way that I think about AI is, at least for sort of how I've been using it, is sort of there's 4 stages. One is you're trying to generate content. The second one, and particularly generative AI, the second one is you're trying to inform that creation. So you pull a lot of your assets together before you then generate it. The third piece is you are then thinking, well, how different parts of my marketing team are all using AI. They're coming out with very different outputs. We're not being consistently distinctive. And so you want to put some guardrails around it so that there's alignment and consistency. And then the fourth piece is, wow, I'm doing all of these wonderful things. I want to figure out how to scale and do it more efficiently. And so that's where you figure out how to automate, do agentic AI. And so what I would say is the process you described is somewhere between the first and the second one. So you are putting some insights into it. You're saying, hey, think about things this way, but you're really not feeding it with sort of the breadth of information that you potentially could. And where I think a platform like Evidenza is helpful is they're taking a lot of different inputs. They're pulling it in, some of which are then proprietary, that allow that output to be more informed. So I'd say yes, directionally.
Customer case studies and stuff like that too. Interesting. Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump into the main thing. So you made this LinkedIn post, and you started the LinkedIn post by saying, when I joined SentinelOne as CMO last year, we set an audacious goal, doubling our LinkedIn followers in a year. So you clearly accomplished this. I saw some people reshare this, and they were almost like saying a CMO should not care about social followers. Like that's not a thing that the CMO of a publicly traded company should care about. I actually saw your old CMO, Henry Schuck, kind of join some of those and be like, it's crazy for you to think that that's his number one priority or that's the only thing that he cares about. But can you break down a little bit why you set that goal? Like, why was that a goal to matter that you decided you as a team should focus on?
Yeah, and definitely did see sort of that post and the response to it, and I sort of chuckled a little bit as I was going through sort of the feed. So, I mean, at the end of the day, as a company, your goal is to drive growth for the organization, and so the primary thing that we actually focus on is how are we generating qualified pipeline that converts into ACV. And obviously, we want to do everything that we can to both help create that quality pipeline and help convert it through. And so if you are going to ask me, like, what is my primary metric, it is that. But as part of doing that, there are lots of things that marketing can do to be supportive of it. And as we just talked about, an important piece is, what are you doing at the top of the funnel so that people are thinking about your brand and better understanding your brand? And in order to do that, you need to be able to reach more people that are in your potential target audience. And you need to be hitting them over time, and you need to be getting them to think about SentinelOne for all of the key components that we talked about earlier. And so in order to do that work at the top of the funnel, there are a number of different things we're trying to do. We're trying to improve share of voice. We're trying to make sure we're actually getting in front of the right audience. We're trying to figure out how can we get the messaging across. And so we have a number of different targets to do that. One of which, knowing that LinkedIn is an important platform, is how do we expand our audience and engage with them as much as we can. And so something that is very much embedded in our sort of approach is we care much more about engagement than we actually do care about follower growth. But follower growth is something that is visibly very easy for us to track relative to our competitors. And so we have a lot of metrics around trying to increase the number of people that engage with our ads, that click through sort of our organic content, et cetera. And in fact, we are several multiples above the industry on sort of those metrics. But yeah, that was sort of what went into it. Is there's a number of different things that each of my teams can do relative to the social team. What are the things that they can be focusing on specific to LinkedIn? And so, yeah, I did think the response of like, the only thing that SentinelOne's CMO is thinking about is driving sort of follower growth was kind of entertaining. And I didn't figure that it was worth responding back to just give that person additional reach. And
right. Now, I assume the people that you are trying to reach and stay top of mind with are security professionals at enterprises, CISO, and all the way down.
So that's certainly true. In addition to that, I think the practical reality, particularly with sort of the significant growth of AI, is anyone with a sort of a developer or IT profile is also very relevant for us. We actually just acquired a company called Prompt Security that's all about sort of AI security and being thoughtful about, as you're developing apps, how are you developing them in a way that is safe in the context of AI when you have users that are potentially using AI. And so I'd say sort of that broader organization is key for us. But as we all know, the buying situation is growing, and sort of the CFO is playing a sort of a broader role. Sometimes you have sort of business stakeholders that are important to consider, because sometimes security can be a hindrance to the organization's operations. And really, you want it to be sort of an important enabler. And so it can include things even on the compliance side. But yeah, I'd say your general characterization is true in terms of the parts of the organization. And then SentinelOne actually services from SMB all the way up into enterprise. And many times we're doing that in tight coordination with our partners, since all of our business actually transacts through our partner ecosystem.
Are you now I mean, that's a technical audience and you're selling a technical product, not like ZoomInfo, for example, where you're selling to go-to-market professionals. Are you thinking about LinkedIn now as the primary or the most important place for SentinelOne to be present? Or where does it stack in your...
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly is a place where a lot of our target audience spends time, and so we do definitely focus there. And there's a lot of benefits that LinkedIn offers in terms of targeting capabilities and things like that, particularly on the paid side. Reddit is also obviously a very important place to spend time. And then more broadly, when we're actually thinking about content creation, because we have people within the marketing team that create content, we have a group called Sentinel Labs, which are sort of our threat ops and researchers, are creating content. That in general, we are doing through sort of blogs, and more holistically trying to reach people either directly through seeing our posts or through any LLM out there and sort of answer engine optimization that we're doing.
Yeah. So you then added over 100,000 followers in 12 months, which is crazy. What were the biggest levers? Like what were the ingredients to being able to create this amount of growth?
Yeah, so there were, I mean, a couple of factors that we took into consideration. And the content was a really important piece, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of really good content and some okay content on LinkedIn. And we firmly believe that we want to create content. We want to be seen as an authority that people want to engage with. And so we, through just general blog posting, we actually created a newsletter that also has had really explosive growth. So that was a very important piece. The second piece was, how do we get more reach so that people are going to engage with it? And a few key learnings for us as we were going through it is how to make it more personable, how to change the sort of mediums, the types of content that we were creating. And so that was a second piece. And then a third piece is and there's a decent amount of writing about this, LinkedIn increasingly is deprioritizing content that comes out of the brands and increasingly prioritizing the content coming out of individuals. So it's been important for us to get our senior executives involved, some of our thought leaders within the organization, getting our broader employee base involved, and then figuring out who are some influencers in the space that can help us generate that content. And so sort of, I think a combination of quality content, the way in which we were sharing the content, and who was sharing the content, all were really important for us.
And then for the executive and the subject matter experts, is it that they might create a piece, or you create a video with someone internal and then that gets shared to the SentinelOne page? Or is it they post it on their profile and link back to SentinelOne, and that's how it's driving the company page growth?
Generally the latter, although we definitely have senior executives who are creating content that we do have the brand share as well. But I think where we've seen a lot of success is, if Tomer has something to say, our CEO, everyone wants to listen. Or if sort of Rick Smith, our president in charge of all of our sort of technology teams, if he has something that he wants to talk about, that's something that's going to land really well with our audience. And so both them creating the content, but I think even potentially more importantly, them sharing the content is where we've seen a lot of goodness. And then importantly, you want people to engage with and react to it. So we definitely encourage our employees to do just that, to comment, to sort of reshare.
Yeah. I mean, if I would have had a pushback on your original post on the company page follows, it would have been that where LinkedIn is going, in my opinion, a better proxy is what are the combined followers of our senior executives at the company. I mean, you obviously have a strong brand. Tomer is active, a bunch of people. Would you agree that that's, I mean, it's harder to track because it's multiple people, but overall a more powerful asset?
It's a really good call out. So yes, and I mean, I think one of the things we've definitely done a good job in getting our executives to be more active. I think we could still do a much better job of getting our executives to be more active. And I think anytime you're tracking something, it has a tendency to get more attention and thus improve more. So yeah, I think it's a really good addition. Really, as part of our first iteration, we wanted to just start getting more growth for SentinelOne, but a very good point. I think we have a lot to do on the sort of executive side, and measuring that would help us get there.
Can you, I think there's a story floating around that it was the CEO at your previous company, Henry Schuck, who's obviously very active on LinkedIn. He was on the show too previously that he had a conversation with you to say, hey, like you need to build up your profile on LinkedIn a little bit, and here's why. Can you tell me about that conversation?
Yeah, and Henry really is amazing in terms of how he's built a presence for himself and for the company. So it was actually when I was CMO there, he said to me, if you're going to be the CMO of our company, you need to have a much bigger profile on LinkedIn, and you need to help us do that as a company. I think at the time it was probably about 4,500 sort of followers, and that was probably 2.5 years ago. Now I'm, I think, closer to 23,000. And I really took to heart what he said. And the first thing that I actually did is I looked at all the influencers I could find in our space, and I reached out to them, and I just said, "Hey, can I talk?" And I asked them, what they've done, where they've been successful, what are the lessons learned that they've had, and then had some of them actually help us at ZoomInfo in generating our content. And so that push was helpful for me as well as for ZoomInfo. And you may have noticed on that post that you pulled up that ZoomInfo was number 4 on that list. And so
Yep.
it definitely was a focus. And then Henry, I think, does a really amazing job in terms of how he generates content. And so I don't know if you follow his as much, but really valuable insights that he provides, but also he shares the product in a really engaging, consumable way that I think is incredibly valuable for people to understand what the product's capabilities are, even if they're existing customers and maybe not fully leveraging.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely one of the examples that I send to people. He's so in the weeds. He's natural at it. I also had Megan Barr on the show a couple of weeks ago, who was their VP comms.
Yeah.
Now she's at Darktrace. So they're doing an amazing job. Now, take me back to that moment when you had to figure it out yourself. From those conversations with the people that you reached out to for advice, what are some of the things that still stick with you now? And maybe what would your advice be to a fellow senior executive at a large company who's thinking about being more active? How would you advise them on how to go forward?
Yeah, and it was it was with Megan that you mentioned that we were trying to figure a lot of this out. So there were. Let me figure out which ones to speak to you first. So I think importantly, what people would say is you really need to figure out like what you are passionate about, because at the end of the day, it's much easier to speak about topics that you find interesting, and as a result, people will sort of take that interest and use it for sort of reasons to follow you. And so hopefully some of those are related to sort of the company. Some of them can be broader. As part of that, you need to be thoughtful of not just doing posts on your brand. And so there's always a sort of mix. I've heard differently from different people, but what are ones that you personally find valuable? What are ones that are relevant to the industry? What are ones that are relevant to your company? And sort of in this case now it's SentinelOne, but at the time it was ZoomInfo. And make sure that you're getting that richness. And certainly something that I see now is when I do more personal posts, they get way more engagement and interest. And so, at the beginning of the year, we had a sales kickoff, and I shared a post about me about ready to get up on stage, and that was probably one of the higher engaging ones because I was generally sharing. It's going to thousands of people I'm about to present in front of, and sort of the nerves that are associated with that. And that's something that everyone can resonate with. So I think that was an important piece that people shared. And then a lot of sort of tips just in terms of how you're generating the content, the importance of making it fairly intuitive. I tend to aim for like a 3rd or 4th grade reading level. Sort of the amount and sort of spacing of the content, pictures, and many times pictures that are closer on individuals and fewer people tend to perform very well. And then that concept that you brought up of how do you get executives that are posting and supporting the brand is really important. So you link back into whichever the company, and then the idea of really sort of taking over. I remember back when I was at ZoomInfo and I'm on the board at Meltwater, as you mentioned, and the CEO said, Bryan, anytime I get onto LinkedIn, I can't avoid posts about your company. I was like, that's wonderful. That's exactly the point. That's what we're going for. We want to be sort of flooding your space. And so that requires, again, everyone that I referenced earlier, posting in aligned ways, consistent topics that really sort of amplify the message and can take over LinkedIn.
How do you think about the value to the company? So at your last company, ZoomInfo, it's a little bit more obvious because obviously you guys sold to go-to-market professionals, and you could talk about your own lessons, your own career insights, and they would be relevant to a ZoomInfo buyer. Now you're selling to technical people, you're selling to cybersecurity people, CISOs, where maybe the things that you naturally can speak to will not necessarily land on the desk of a CISO. So how do you think about it now as like, what's the value of your CMO being active when your audience is CISOs or CTOs or VPs of engineering?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and don't know that I've necessarily mastered quite yet. But yeah, I mean, how to be an effective CMO was really successful in sort of my previous role, less so here. And so what I've tried to figure out is, what are some topics that can potentially bridge that gap? And so, whether it's, I'm potentially going to a CISO forum, and some of the topics that are coming up from the conversations, or sort of the challenges that they have, or just as a function of the fact that I mean, I think a big part of what marketing is doing is you're trying to aggregate a lot of perspectives, rather than sales is trying to have more sort of one-to-one conversations. Are there things like that I can potentially share, based on
Mm-hmm.
everything we hear with all of our customers, or sort of an event or whatnot, and surfacing those pieces up? But I would say that is a balance that I've tried to strike. And I think as a result, I probably leaned a little bit more heavily into sort of SentinelOne related content,
Mm-hmm.
just to make sure that it's as relevant as possible. And at the same time, what the research does show us is you have your specific buyers, and then you have people that influence your buyers. And so there is still value in, like, how do you get people, the broader company, thinking about SentinelOne, so that they then have conversations with, the CISO, or, someone in the IT organization, and saying, oh, like, I heard about, this thing with AI and, generative AI, and how are we protecting against our employees? And I know SentinelOne does something in that space. All of those things add up. But yeah, in terms of directly reaching the audience, I have leaned more into SentinelOne content.
I would also assume, I mean, from the other execs that I talked to, one job of any functional leader is always recruiting. And so if you speak about your marketing lessons and insights, at the very least, it will help you attract marketing talent to your team at SentinelOne, which you always need more of.
For sure. And actually, one of the better posts that I did was about us opening up a bunch of roles at the beginning of the year. And I think an important area where we work with our HR team is, how do we create a presence that's reflective of SentinelOne's culture externally, because it does help with recruiting. And so it is very much something that we do. We do see good engagement with our recruiting related posts, and just our overall brand is a component of what we do to people who are trying to buy, plus the people who might be potential employees for us in the future.
How would you pitch this idea of being active on LinkedIn to the CEO of a large company? I mean, most companies are not at all anywhere close to as forward thinking as you guys are. And obviously, I have these conversations all the time. Most B2B companies don't think it's worth their time to be on LinkedIn, certainly not the CEO. Well, how would you frame why this makes sense?
Sure. Yeah. And again, I still think we have a lot of room for improvement in terms of our executives and sort of their engagement. I really appreciate the engagement we have, but we certainly could have more. So I think it's a few things. One, you need to highlight the value. And depending on the executive, part of what I talk about is sort of that research-backed approach in terms of how our brains work. And there's actually research behind it, which I think tends to land. And so maybe people conceptually get it. I think then the second piece is, okay, great, I'm open to doing it, but I don't have time. And so then it's, okay, how do we overcome that barrier? And so one of the things that we'll do for sort of our bigger announcements is we'll actually generate all of that content for our executives, and then help them post it. Something that I've been done in the past is, depending on the executive, they may give you access to sort of their LinkedIn. You can actually post on their behalf. Something that we do more broadly is we use platforms that actually allow you to share content across the organization. But so I think first one is getting them to buy in. Second one is, how do you make it easier for them to post? I think the third one is, how can you get them to be active and engage with anything that they post? And I think that's probably the most challenging one to overcome. But where I've kind of approached that is, when I first have those conversations, who are the executives that are more interested in number one and number two that I mentioned? And then I can say, hey, how do I help and facilitate? Maybe we can get you some additional support, so it's easier to do the things that you're doing. And if you can get them excited, hopefully you then can get the next person excited. Because I think most things in marketing are perfect idea, and then what's the way to get close to that perfect idea? And if your perfect idea, as you said, is thinking about not only your brand, but all of your executives, you may not get all of your executives excited. And so it's let's try and stair step our way, try and get someone wanting to do it, and then go from there.
The one that stuck with me, I had Irina Novoselsky on the podcast, the CEO at Hootsuite, and she's obviously very active on LinkedIn. And when I asked her that question, she was like, well, does the CEO talk to customers? And if the answer is yes, then your customers are on LinkedIn. Those are often, the people that you do want to engage and comment on. And so if you believe it's the CEO's role to be in conversations with customers and prospects, then this is just another way of doing it at scale 24/7.
Completely agree. Well, and even related to that, so going back to the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and what I mentioned in terms of distinctive brand assets, particularly for founder-led companies, for many of those, your CEO is an important asset that you have. And so that's something that you really then should, and you certainly should lean into. And for those who aren't familiar with the idea, really it's thinking about, for anything that you have, how much does it create fame, or sort of, for any asset, when someone sees it, they associate it with your company. And then the second one is uniqueness. When they see it, they only associate it with your company. And on both of those dimensions, the CEO can be really powerful, because the more they're known, they're likely not going to be mistaken with another company. And so it can be a really, really powerful brand asset to try and deploy and take advantage of.
Yeah, and I'm assuming it also plays into your point on distinctiveness. Is if you have the asset of still having a founder being the CEO of your company, oftentimes they're quite opinionated and have very strong opinions and insights about the industry because they've been leading this company for a decade plus. And if you can leverage that somehow, that's probably going to score on the distinctiveness scoreboard somewhere, right?
And also, I think for many founders, they both have the passion, and they've had to figure out how to translate that passion into results. And so many times they've found a way to be sort of effective sellers. And so I think both of those together make it even more powerful.
Yeah. Now, in your post, you talked about the internal brand ambassador program and the customer advocacy program. I think I saw the S1 crew exist.
Yeah.
Can you speak to those two, what they are, and maybe how you created them?
Yeah, because always trying to think of ways to get people excited and motivate them. And so I think one way to do that is to sort of make people feel a part of a group. And a second way to do that is to try and create a little bit of sort of competition and just as a way to motivate folks. So we definitely have both internal and external. From an internal perspective, that is the S1 crew. And what we found is there were just a lot of people who were active that we wanted to bring in. And then there were some people that had great followings, but maybe weren't as active as we wanted them to be. And so we wanted to formalize a bit of a program, put sort of a name around it to help with that, and then facilitate sort of their engagement and sort of ideas for how they can be more effective. At the same time, we wanted to do that sort of externally with sort of influencers, with customers. Something that is maybe a little bit more unique to this space relative to my previous one is not all customers want to be advertising that they're customers, because at the end of the day, a CISO is most concerned about protecting everything within their walls of their company. And something that obviously SentinelOne's very proud of is the fact that we're leveraging AI to constantly be a step ahead of our potential threats out there, and using behavioral AI to always identify sort of new potential threats. That all said, a CISO may not want to be advertising, hey, this is the way that I'm protecting myself.
Right.
And so I think that's been something that we've tried to think about, is how can we, in the context of those potential concerns, how can we get people open to being more public on our behalf? And so I would say we're still very much in the process of building out that community and the people that then can advocate on our behalf. And so as part of that, we are using influencers who are sort of already thought leaders in the space and trying to get them.
For the internal ambassador programs, the employees at SentinelOne, do you have any scoreboard incentive set up? I don't know, who gets the most engagement gets a bonus at the end of the year, anything of that sort?
So we haven't done that yet. We actually we did something like that at ZoomInfo, where if you go on to if you went onto mine or onto sort of Henry's LinkedIn, we had a number of ways that you could link from the page into SentinelOne. And we, as part of the URL, we had a way to track And so it was a way to see how many demos is Henry
Mm.
driving versus Brian driving versus someone else.
Mhm.
And so I would say it was something that there was awareness internally on. We didn't necessarily have a competition. Henry was the number one. I think I was the number two. But yeah, it is helpful to have some visibility so that you can try and create some internal motivation.
Now, I've seen you talk about the buyer's day one list. Can you just talk about that a little bit, the importance of it, and maybe how all of this obviously ties into
Yeah,
that?
yeah, and so that research actually came from Bain and Google, and what they looked in sort of the B2B space across verticals, whether it was product or services, is that buyers typically have a day one list. It's 80 to 90% of the time they have a day one list. About 2/3 of the time, it's actually only one company. And then
Hmm.
about 90% of the time, they end up choosing from that day one list. And so it's actually really important to make sure that you are on that day one list. And then I think some research that originally came out of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute is, and it gets quoted differently, but sort of, the 95% of buyers aren't in market at any point in time, 5% are, or 90% 10. The reason why that number varies is it's a function of two things. How long is the buying cycle, and how often do people consider sort of new technology? So if your buying cycle is once every 4 years, so that would be 25%. If the buying cycle is then a quarter, it would be 25%. 25% times 25% would then get you your math, which is a little bit over 5%. But if it's
Hmm.
happens every 2 years and it's a 6-month buying cycle, that would change the math. But
Hmm.
so that's why, regardless of the exact number, it's really important to be getting that broad group that's not yet in a buying situation, so that when they're in the buying situation, they think about you and you're on the day one list.
And so this marketing to the 95%, I would say most people would consider that brand marketing. Now, you've run marketing at companies, that are operating at 1 billion plus in revenue. What were maybe some brand investment that looked dumb on the spreadsheet initially, but that worked out in the long term? And how do you justify those things to the CFO?
Yeah, and as you were saying, that made me smile. The CMO for a long time at Tableau, Lisa Fink, who's really amazing. She made a comment which is sort of every demand touch point is a brand touch point.
Mm.
And that was I would say, sort of a strongly held belief that she had based on sort of her experience. There's evidence coming out of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute that that's actually that is true. So I think we have this idea that you do a bunch of brand activities, and all of a sudden, 6 months, a year down the line, there's value. And what they've actually found is that that's not true. If a brand investment is going to impact demand at some point in time, it will start doing it right away. It's just additive. It accumulates over time. And so I think that's the sort of the context then for sort of my comments, which are uh, certainly some CEOs that I have talked about will push back and say, hey, this isn't a very good use of effort, whether it's sort of trying to do a video, or you're trying to sort of show up bigger at an event and sort of make a splash. But I do think they ultimately are helping with getting top of mind. I would say the way that I test for it, and then maybe I'll get into sort of your bad
Hmm.
investment. So actually, LinkedIn a year ago had a beta that they no longer have. They didn't turn it into a product, which is a bummer, but that you actually could serve videos on sort of the broader web through their platform. And then you could serve demand ads through LinkedIn. And what we found
Hmm.
is that we did an audience that got brand, we did an audience that got demand, those circles overlapped, is that when people saw the brand and demand ads, they engaged with the demand ads at a much higher rate, to the point where it was actually cheaper to spend money on brand and demand based on the outputs that you would get. We did something similar with StackAdapt, and what we found, and we looked at it at a company level, when we targeted those companies with brand ads, would we see sort of the goodness going all the way through, which we again did. So with those as perspective, what we actually then try to figure out is how broad do we want to go, and we actually found out if we go fairly broad with our targeting at the top of the funnel, that it's better. And so I think one of the things that maybe we sort of over focus on is how targeted we should be. But with StockAdapt, we actually went more broad with the audience. Obviously, not everyone at the company, but people that may not be sort of our immediate buying group. And what we found is doing that broader targeting not only made the sort of per impression cheaper, but it actually saw overall company level improvements. And so I would say, I don't know that you're always having that conversation with your CFO about the targeting, but in terms of like how to think about it, that might have been considered wasted money, but we found it actually was way more effective.
So is the right, am I getting it right that the idea is that through the brand spend, you're getting an incremental lift in performance on the demand ads? Maybe like colloquially, you could say because you're warming people up, and so they're then more likely to respond to the demand ads.
Yes, and so I mean, it's a few things. Yeah, you could warm people up. There's a lot of research that shows that we get inundated with ads. So whatever's the number, but sort of let's say potentially north of 1,000 per day. We're doing everything we can to ignore them. The more that you actually see sort of something from a brand, the more likely you are to pay attention to it. The more likely you are to pay attention to it, the more likely you are to remember it. I think that the second piece is there's a lot of research around our brains remember things much more effectively when there's storytelling or emotion involved. And so many times in a brand ad or in a demand ad, you're not going to get those things, but in a brand ad, you can. And so it helps with your ability to have success on that front. And then I think there's just also a practical reality that many times when you're doing broad-based scaled brand, the per impression cost is potentially less than the per impression cost on a demand gen ad. And so by getting sort of that reach, you're also potentially just being more efficient in how you're doing your marketing.
Just connecting the dots here, I'm now curious, like to where, given what you said with going broad actually was ROI positive, where if you have, let's say, your CFO creating content on LinkedIn and that's relevant for finance persona, even though your buyer is a CISO, you can then promote that with thought leader ads towards the finance people at your target accounts to go broad while still having relevant content for that persona. And if you obviously replicate that across
For sure.
your CFO, your CMO, your CTO, you can almost cover all the bases with a few execs creating the content that they're passionate about.
Yeah.
Even though it's not fully relevant.
And I mean, something that's, I mean, certainly true in our space. Our CISO will be, presenting some of the things we're working on to the leadership team. We'll present it to the board, and that, all of those are chances for other execs to sort of weigh in with ideas. I think that same type of reality is true for other parts of the organization as well. Whether you're thinking about a big CPQ project or trying to figure out how to optimize your go-to-market, and so there is just a lot of value of trying to influence the broader C-suite as you're thinking about trying to have success, particularly if you're trying to do really large deals at a company that are going to be of the size that you're going to have, executives talking about them and making decisions at scale about how to invest their dollars.
Now, zooming out a little bit from our, excursion here into LinkedIn and executive thought leadership, obviously you have a very, very impressive career in enterprise software. A lot of things are changing right now in marketing with AI and lots of new tools. What are maybe some principles that you wish you had known when you became a CMO that still apply today, that are translatable into this new era?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things for me, because my first 12 years of my career were actually in sort of strategy and both consulting internally and then in analytics. And so, I got into marketing now about sort of 10 years ago. But as I was coming in, I mean, there was a lot that I was trying to figure out and learn. If I could go back and tell that person, I mean, at the end of the day, your customer and the perceptions you can get from your customer are incredibly valuable. And so doing everything you can to figure out how to take advantage of that at scale. And so I think there's a lot of ways with AI. So I mentioned we can now do synthetic audience work for anyone who has call recording within their organizations. That is a gold mine, because you can use it to understand, from a product marketing perspective, like what messaging is working. Are your reps even using the sort of assets that you're creating for them? When certain types of topics come up, you're more or less successful. When certain competitors are mentioned, where do we have success versus not? And so I think there's just lots of scaled ways to better get that information, including things that you can do on your website, et cetera. I think a second thing that I knew was important there, and I think just continues to be important, is how do you move quickly and how do you test and iterate? So this is now sort of dated. It was a conversion rate optimization conference that I went to. It was sort of one of the leaders of the sort of the testing program at Hotwire. So that company doesn't really exist anymore. But what she highlighted is something that I found true, which is a third of the time you have an opinion, you test it, you're right. A third of the time, you have an opinion, you test it, you're wrong. A third of the time, it's inconclusive, which essentially means 2/3 of the time, you're wrong. And it means that you need to be doing a lot of testing, because even if you're well informed, you're not going to get the outcomes that you expect. And I do think AI allows us to test much, much faster. And so I'd say sort of that's the second one that I would think through. And then that third piece that we spend a lot of time talking about, being consistently distinctive, I think is critical. You really want to figure out what are those few messages, what are those few assets, and how just over time across channels do you hammer them home? Because that's ultimately what you need to figure out how to do, is how are you going to really stand out? And then the last piece related to that is, ideally you're informing those few messages and few assets with a perspective, again, back from your audience of, what's their thinking that they're going to have in those buying situations, and where's their white space between you and your competitors, so that there's certain things that your customers are thinking about or your prospects are thinking about, but no one's doing a really good job talking about those things. And so I would say those are all things that maybe I had thoughts about when I started, wish I had maybe had them more concretely. And then I do think there's a lot of ways that AI allows you to take advantage and build off those more effectively.
I saw your presentation at the Winter Games last year,
Okay, yeah.
where you talked about the three big GTM bets that you were making, and the first one, the biggest one, was essentially figuring out how to use GenAI. What are maybe some ways that you and your team are using AI today? And I know maybe the synthetic kind of user research is one of them that you're using today that are actually operational, that are actually creating some lift. And maybe the answer is it's all experimental right now, but anything that's standing out to you right now?
Yeah, so synthetic audience is definitely one. I think the second piece is, as I mentioned, we have a lot of different groups that are creating content within the organization. And so we're trying to inform that content creation. But I think where we've seen a lot of goodness is actually taking that content creation and then repackaging it in different ways. And so we actually put out a sort of a cloud report now a couple of months ago that was based on a lot of different blogs that we had written. And that got really valuable sort of feedback and a lot of positive praise from customers, prospects, and even analysts that were talking about our thought leadership. And it was based on a lot of great content we created, but it was actually refactoring that content.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was sort of a really important piece for us. We're also using it now as we think about sort of visual asset creation. And so, as we're doing sort of new ads, et cetera, we're actively involving AI there. And then sort of not always in marketing at companies, but for our SDRs, we're using it very heavily in sort of creating plays, creating sort of the talk tracks, facilitating the email outreach that we're doing sort of within that space. And I think we're seeing a lot of success there also.
Do you have any, if you can name them, any current favorite tools that you're actively using in your day-to-day that's kind of a new addition to your own stack that you can share without,
So, and actually, there's a fourth area around sort of answer engine optimization, AEO. And so two in particular I'll call out there. GrowthX AI, I found to be very, very valuable in terms of creating content, and whether that's taking sort of a topic that you're already writing about and sort of doing it more effectively at speed, generating sort of content in a new area, or helping refine content that you already have. We also use Profound as a sort of visibility tool to help us understand sort of what different LLMs are caring about, where they're looking in terms of key sources, what might be relevant topics, what are your competitors doing. So I think those are really valuable. I already mentioned Evidenza on the synthetic audience side. We then use the Google stack internally for a lot of our content. So sort of Gemini and Notebook, that's just sort of a company-wide decision. So we're very actively taking advantage of those. And then relative to some of the SDR activities, we do lean into ZoomInfo and some of their AI capabilities there. And then we are actively sort of actually exploring sort of a few supplemental ones to think about further. And I also use Qualified on our website and some of their AI capabilities.
Amazing. Well, Bryan, thank you so much for taking the time. I was able to pursue all of my little interests and rabbit holes that I wanted to pursue. Obviously, if people want to check you out, I'll link both your LinkedIn profile and the SentinelOne stuff in the show notes below. Any last notes, anything that I should have asked about that I didn't ask about?
No, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciated being here.